Okay. Welcome. This is the prep for Wednesday the 11th, Wednesday office Wednesday office hours, and we may be coming around, although it is a perennial issue. That is the transformation problem for Marx, which some people will claim does not exist for interesting and reasonable reasons, often based on the inability to define what price and value are, as well as the ultimately what it relates to is the tendency for the rate of profit to fall, and then ultimately crisis, chaos, and revolution. And, all very interesting. Um, we're going to get there eventually. I would assert to you, though, that in terms of the Wednesday office hour, we will, hmm, be discussing. At least this first article is on a page or a website called Phases. And we'll start here and then move somewhere else in terms of discussing this. The underlying point, of course, and usefulness is that we can discuss, as this piece does, understanding oil, which is the current political issue. All right. So the person who writes this, Phases, Um, the author of this puts a note at the front end. Late in dissertation writing, I tried to make sense of the relationship between price and value in Marx's Capital, and further, to figure out whether this could be clarifying for thinking about successive oil price regimes. None of it really quite came together as I'd hoped, though it was nevertheless helpful, head-clearing work for me. I plan to release these notes in three parts. Part one, that's this one, reviews the transformation problem. Part two examines the transfer of uneven magnitudes of value underneath price equivalencies. That alone is an issue. And part three attempts to tie these insights together in the historical context of oil capital. Together, this was theoretical work that fed into my study of early American oil exchanges, summarized here, part one and part two. Uh, the history of oil is, quite fascinating, problematic. The source of the dominance of various nations in terms of industrial revolutions, etc., and has created the current kind of resource problems that we have, where oil is in one place and industry is in another, although that's obviously resolving itself. So, part one, notes on the transformation problem. Observations that commodities can sell at prices, that is, exchange ratios that do not reflect their values, that is, i.e., socially necessary labor time, has motivated a rich debate within Marxism. And it has often been suggested that this discrepancy is not an exception to, but the normal condition of capitalist exchange. In this post, Phases offers, some notes on the significance of this price-value distinction for Marx's theory of value, and in particular, damn it, sorry. In this post, I offer some notes on the significance of this price-value distinction for Marx's theory of value, and in particular, its relation to the so-called transformation problem. First, it is useful to sketch the theory of prices formulated by the classical economists, which Marx moves against in the development of his own theory of value. Of course, long before Marx, it had been widely recognized that market prices fluctuated in accordance with changes to supply and demand. Early economists had posited that sorry, back again. First, it's useful to sketch the theory of prices formulated by the classical economists, which Marx moves against in the development of his own theory of value. Of course, long before Marx, it had been widely recognized that market prices fluctuated in accordance with changes to supply and demand. Early economists had posited that these movements oscillated around a center of gravity, what they called the natural price of a given commodity. Note, of course, that the use of an idea like center of gravity is also provocative and for a variety of reasons, none the least of which comes back to us as econophysics. Natural prices were themselves thought to be the consequence of the law of equal profitability, which suggests that capital regulates individual profitability by flowing into sectors with high rates of profit, increasing their supply until market prices sink, and conversely exiting sectors with low rates of profit until the scarcity of output increases prices. That's Anwar Sheikh, 1977. These market-wide movements determine the average profit rate, which, when combined with the cost of production input specific to a given commodity, determines and differentiates its natural price, which, because of this derivation, is also known as its price of production. And lest you think that's unimportant, people are going to make money from the current war as I speak. There's a war going on. Or if you're, stupid, you could call it a major combat operation. Not use the word war, but everyone uses the word war. Famously, David Ricardo suggested that variations in natural prices were themselves ultimately determined by the specific quantities of labor required to produce different commodities. Marx raises one of his many criticisms of Ricardo precisely on this point. Now, Marx, in Theories of Surplus Value, reveals Ricardo's error. That is, labor costs are not determined by quantities of labor at all, but rather by wages. Now, in making this distinction, Marx stressed that the magnitude of labor embodied in a commodity is not simply a physical input, but already socially mediated, namely by the value form, the value form. Value form is equally problematic for a variety of reasons in terms of how you describe it, and there's an entire literature for this that remains interesting, problematic, current. Some people, non-economists, focus on this in some ways in order to resolve in a perhaps an idiographic way by using the word form, and Marx does, to sort of resolve the issue, when in fact it qualitatively it perhaps is not. But that's why we've been looking recently at critical realism in order to help resolve, but not finally resolve that problem. Back to the text. Further, as Anwar Sheikh notes, 1977, Marx relates this revelation to another of Ricardo's errors, that is, his failure to disclose the origin of profit, which he regarded as a self-evident factor of production. You can get into a whole thing about how evident it is, but that's another story. By contrast, Marx spends much of volume 1 of Capital trying to show where profit comes from, bearing in mind this distinction between the concrete labor contributed to the production of the commodity and the wage received for this concrete labor contribution. As he suggests, at least within generalized commodity production mediated through wage labor, profits can only arise from surplus value. Now, it may arise, but is it identical to? That's another kind of question. That is, it follows from the surplus labor produced by workers for which they do not receive compensation in the form of wage. Now, this gets further complicated, of course. Let me break here for a second. And this gets further problematized because of the difference between labor as work itself and labor power, the kind of expectation in perhaps labor time, but among other things, in effort, the expectations about labor that are made of, the worker. So back to the text. In the third volume of Capital, Marx makes many significant adjustments to his argument, removing a lot of the assumptions. For example, as our current issues are, the perfect competition issue, which, should have been gone a long time ago, but it was maintained in order to prop up certain other ideas that are beneficial for certain theoretical viewpoints, that is neoclassical economics, among other things. Now, he maintains in volume 1, this is the assumptions he makes in volume 1. Notably, he also returns to the prices of production concept in order to again insist that the latter are derived not from the physical quantities of embodied labor, but the magnitudes of value of the production inputs. Okay, so it's not about this kind of essentialist idea of an embodied labor necessarily, but by the magnitudes of value of the production inputs. That is, the magnitudes of the money capital advanced for purchase of the means of production, that is constant capital, raw material and equipment, etc., and labor power, stuff from workers, the variable capital. Now, this so-called transformation of the magnitudes of labor values into magnitudes of the price of production, explored in volume 3 of Capital, the book Capital, has proven to be one of the prickliest points of contention in Marx's theory of value, first pointed out by J.V. Komarzinski in 1897 and further popularized by Ladislaus Borkowitz in 1907. One key part of the argument raised against Marx is that this transformation involves an erroneous, or at least unjustifiable, assumption that the variable capital and constant capital employed in the production process are purchased at their values, i.e., at a price equivalent for the socially necessary labor time necessary for production. Let me break here for a second and say, this is why I've become interested, just to explain my interest in this, is ideas of subsumption, indexicality, that these are ways in which we can think and talk about this exact transformation problem, among other things. And the purchasing at value, is kind of, tautological or problematic or whatever, but you sort of need to get all these things sort of at hand and to understand the kind of abstraction that, is signified in this particular set of operations. So anyway, back to the text. The initial solution was thus, that is, given that the inputs of capitalist production are themselves commodities, and thus are also mediated by prices, the calculation of the prices of production and hence the general rate of profit must itself start with the magnitudes of the prices of the inputs, not that of their values. You can see this is like a shell game, right? And so that's the kind of issue that Andrew Kleinman brings up as referenced here in his 2011 piece. Now, it you can spend a lot of ink on that problem because trying to solve the transformation problem by a variety of, you could say, kind of sleight of hand arguments is interesting. But does it get us anywhere? It's interpretively interesting, but does it achieve, sort of causal explanatory power in that particular context? Anyway, back to the text. Introducing the work of Borkowitz to the Anglophone world, that is, in the work of Paul Sweezy, provides the classic discussion of this alternative solution to the transformation problem. So, the Borkowitz-Sweezy model, as Fred Mosley has termed it in 2021, is composed or comprised of a dualistic set of input-output matrices deployed for calculating, respectively, the magnitudes of value and price across three quote unquote departments of social production, i.e., means of production, wage goods, and luxury goods. The discrepancy among them is resolved through the implementation of quote unquote transformation coefficients, which are then applied to both the inputs and outputs of production in value terms to yield the correct price magnitudes. Let me break here for a second, and this is nothing controversial. In fact, it's very quite standard in order to think about this as a function of coefficients and a set of matrices that are input-output and that are a variety of ways in which we can talk about the goods as well as the means of production and other kinds of things. And in this case, a third department called luxury goods, which, what counts as a luxury is often problematic in and of itself because it has a bizarre relativism built into it. But anyway, in the desert, a glass of water is a luxury. Anyway, but back to the text, but the Borkowitz-Sweezy model has by no means settled the debate surrounding the transformation problem. It doesn't. It hasn't. For one, the rather convoluted process involved in converting magnitudes of value into prices has led to many to question whether quantifying value at all is an unnecessary and sterile muddle. Now, you may or may not want to agree with Paul Samuelson on this matter, but in fact, that is, the crux of the Samuelson critique on this matter, and it is of course interesting and important to see that Samuelson, who, for all intents and purposes, is a Keynesian or a neoclassical, however you want to describe him, but at least he tackled questions about Sraffa and Marx in the post-war period, mainly because he'd become successful and, he could have the kind of luxury, as it were, to do that. Anyway, back to the text. Indeed, if the whole point is to arrive at prices of production, as seems to be suggested by Marx's return to the concept in volume 3, now even that assumption is problematic. But anyway, why bother calculating value in the first place? Relatedly, it has been cast as a special point of embarrassment for orthodox Marxism. All those folks who are angry at sort of new readings of Marx and Western Marxism, I suppose, and a heterodox Marxism as opposed to a orthodox Marxism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that capitalists are not themselves aware of or disposed toward any embodied labor calculation. That's Jeff Hodgson's kind of point, at least in 1974. So capitalists do not think of capital outlays, wages, productivity, or profitability in quote unquote value terms. They think exclusively in and hence act according to and are motivated solely by prices. Let me break here for a second and say, value term, this is a language problem. It is a problem that everything is red. If you want to go to a quantitative solution for this, the difference between prices and value, and what is that? And that raises a whole bunch of other kinds of issues relative to capitalists. Capitalists maybe aren't concerned so much about value in this particular context, but they are interested in something that does account for capital outlays, wages, productivity, and profitability. And they see it correlated somehow to a price system, a market system, and a currency system. So it's all kind of, it's not irrelevant. It's just that there's a kind of a connection among all of these matters. So against the charge of the redundancy, I see you've already gone to some place by saying, well, is it price or value? And is that redundant? So against the charge of redundancy in Marx's theory of value, Paul Sweezy, had made clear that proceeding solely on the basis of price calculations, moreover, solely from the perspective of capital, loses sight of the essence of Marx's critique of political economy. That is, showing that profit is not derived from thrift, and that's a big deal in the 19th century, nor does it spontaneously emerge in the exchange process, but rather, it isn't because things are just simply moving around or being accumulated, but rather it is the result of the production of something more, palpable, I suppose, or more immediate, or some way in which we could talk about accumulation without necessarily or separating out the difference between a kind of a relative wealth as opposed to an absolute wealth, or something that is much more fluid, a stock as opposed to a flow. Anyway, but rather it's the result of the production of surplus value expressed as a, quote, deduction from the product of total social labor, close quote, which is left unaccounted for in the monetary expression of value. Now, that lends itself to a whole bunch of other things, that is it really left unaccounted for? And, the monetary expression of value, which we just talked about, has these other possibilities built into it, other meanings, as it were, that a capitalist would have, right? I mean, it is a bunch of things, not necessarily one thing that is easily sort of described as as money or as a price, but rather there's a bunch of other things that are part of this kind of collection ensemble or whatever. So anyway, back to the text. He only thinks in terms of price. In other words, the origin of profit and surplus value is masked behind the merely formal relationship between the total capital outlay and the return on investment. So already you have this, sort of arbitrary distinction in terms of moment of time between stuff you put out and stuff that you get back. So it is thus only by tracking, so obviously there is a spatiotemporal issue, it is thus only by tracking the production of value by bracketed, that is, abstract labor, abstract in brackets. It's only by tracking the production of value by abstract labor that one can follow Marx to his conclusion that capitalism is an inherently exploitative system. So what we're seeing here is, on the one hand, an old idea on alienation that becomes, we can say more flexibly, let's say, as or more literary, metaphorically, the difference between, alienation and exploitation, etc., which, is actually very 19th century in that sense. As I. Rubin had surmised, quote, the specific character of Marx's labor theory of value lies in the fact that Marx does not base his theory on the properties of value, i.e., on the acts of equalization and evaluation of things, but on the properties of labor in the commodity economy. See, the word commodity has now come back into it because commodity is a way in which you can talk about many different things that include exchange and a variety of other things. And in fact, money itself is at one point a commodity, right? So, but on the properties of labor in the commodity economy, i.e., on the analysis of the working structure and production relations of labor. So you already have an agency structure thing described here. So within Marxist scholarship, the alternative solution introduced by Borkowitz and Sweezy has also been challenged as itself a capitulation to the non-Marxist demand that the economy functions according to a quote-unquote general equilibrium. And this has a very long history, one problematized in a variety of ways and by very important folks, and does have mathematical implications, but also has an implication for certain more, some people might describe it as analytic or functionalist versions of Marxism. So Freeman, 1995, Sheikh, 1977, Fine and Sadfilo of 2010. Moreover, Fred Mosley, writing in 2016, drawing on the TSSI, the temporal single system interpretation, and you need to see Kleiman and McClone of 1988, 1999, argues that the entire idea of a transformation problem stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of Marx's critique, which knows only one system, the actual and temporally sequential process of capital accumulation. So for Mosley, attempts to distinguish the initial value of inputs to production from production prices in order to derive both simultaneously through input-output matrices completely disregards Marx's insistence that capital accumulation can only be understood as a circuit, capital M dash capital C dash capital M prime, where the initial capital M is given before the rate of profit, and hence the prices of production can be determined. Now, this is to argue that it disregards Marx's insistence is, a whole another set of questions about whether it regards or disregards. And I know to break it down, sort of in this very basic way, is also a transformational problem in a variety of other ways. So anyway, back to the text. Further, in the sequential determination of production prices, the constant capital and variable capital expended at the beginning, capital M, has already been represented objectively and socially as this actual quantity of money capital advance, mostly 2016. Recall, the above point of critique Marx makes against Ricardo, that is, capital does not pay for units of labor, it pays for wages. So already, let's get back to our, let me break here for a second. This already gets back to our initial question of the difference between, labor power, labor, wages, etc. On the one hand, you could say they're all the same thing. On the other hand, it's very clear that you need to think about this in sort of a multifaceted sort of way. The value of the inputs to production are never understood by Marx to be ideal units, reified units, if you will, of labor time, which must be later corrected through substitution with actual prices. They are, in fact, the same actual quantities of money capital expended on constant capital and variable capital, which had been given in volume 1. This is part of let me break here again. This is part of an argument that tries to distinguish between the fact that, volume 1 of Capital gets published, gets out there and is, absorbed by a whole bunch of folks, whereas volume 2 and 3 takes a while and Marx is already dead. This is sort of the work of Engels in that sense, not, et cetera. Anyway, the quantity of money advanced, M, in other words, is never assumed to be proportional to the labor time necessary to produce it. The former are simply the actual given magnitudes of the money variable capital and money constant capital with which the production process begins. See, already there's a kind of, you can problematize this for a variety of other reasons. back to the text. What is crucial to bear in mind here is that throughout capital, the center of analysis is thus the new value, which emerges only within the production process. That's Freeman from 1995. Now, this is, only through the only within the production process is, it represents, a certain point of view that presumes that productivity only occurs at, sort of one quote unquote level, material reality, whereas the point of sort of dealing with Marx as financialization, etc., is to, to take it away from or not identical to labor itself, but rather at the abstract level of what counts as quote unquote equivalence of this labor power thing. And yes, you can treat it with a whole bunch of other ways of talking about it. You can euphemize it in a variety of ways, socially necessary labor time and, et cetera, et cetera, which is not problematic. In fact, it's very important to identify the functional differences among these matters. Rather, back to the text, the derivation of the magnitude of surplus value is necessary to calculate the production prices. The magnitude of surplus value, derivation of the magnitude of surplus value is necessary to calculate the production prices. But this does not elicit any retroactive transformation of the inputs. Yeah. Rather, it simply denotes that the employment of labor power is subsequent to the capital advanced, M, and thus employed labor power must first reproduce the value necessary to remunerate the capitalist for M in order to then go on to produce gratis the surplus value, which determines the rate of profit and in turn the prices of production. That the point is that you never have one circuit of capital. You have multiple circuits of capital, because that's the whole point. But often this argument is only seen as a single sequence, and hence that's why you got to this sort of TSSI version, which does not, I would assert, and yes, it is a very long discourse, and I'm not trying not to insult anybody who believes this. It's just simply that it is a stock flow problem, among other things, and it is this idea that it's not one circuit, it's many circuits, or it's multiple circuits, however you want to think about it. So anyway, back to the text. It's worth pausing to note that bourgeois economics had recognized its own inability to derive profit from capital outlays by the 1950s. That's one aspect of the broader, yes, and there's a huge literature, Cambridge capital controversy. This is Sraffa, et cetera, neo-Ricardians and all that stuff. The initial concern here was that the quantity of capital expressed by the neoclassical production function was meaningless given the heterogeneity of the units of measurement for the value of capital goods. That is, cost price, which we don't talk very much about, but cost price is problematic. Purchasing power, productivity, and see Joan Robinson, 1953. Further, within any of these measures, it is also the case that the value of capital changes over time, which is what I just said, because of multiple circuits, through depreciation. Now, you could argue, in fact, that depreciation is a capital circuit. That would be interesting and probably worth a lot of work. Without any stability in the unit of now, see, this assumes that without any stability in the unit of measure for capital inputs, profitability cannot be reliably measured. Now, you've already assumed a problem here, and that is maybe not necessarily assumed. It kind of, it's a kind of an a priori problem, that there is no stability in the unit of measure for capital inputs. I would assert to you that the unit of measure is probably stable. It is a variety of other things that are going on, and which is kind of the basis of the price value problem. So anyway, as Jeff Hodgson has stressed, 1974, this controversy rebukes not only the neoclassical model of prices, but also the tendency towards a naive substantialism, which I just referred to as sort of essentialism, naive substantialism among many Marxian economists who often assume that the value magnitude of capital is composed of static dead labor. And of course, you get down to the, well, authorially speaking, he says static dead labor, as do many others. And that's not the thing. But anyway, so what, in other words, the capital controversy clarifies specifically for Marxists is that the magnitude of value does not abide by any law of conservation. And Murawski has a wide literature that should be referred to here in 1989, as it can only ever be determined in relation to present total social output. To note, this is precisely what Marx had meant by socially necessary, which is in itself continually in flux. So a law of conservation. Now, you already see here that there's the, physicist or the, physical science thing that's going on here. And you need to be just careful as we move forward, how you make these kinds of judgments just from a language point of view. Anyway, quote, no measure of the amount of capital, be it value, price, or whatever, is independent of the rate of profit and the distribution of the product between social classes. As these alter, so too will the book value of the bourgeois world. The consequence of heterogeneity is that there is no independent measure of capitalist wealth. Did you need to have one, I guess, would be the question that I would ask Hodgson. Thus, not only price, but value too, can only be meaningfully understood in processual terms, which is what I just said in terms of circuits, as Andrea Ricci has just argued. Quote, the substance of value qua abstract labor is potentiality in becoming rather than actuality already become. It's amazing that it's taken, how many, a century and a half to sort of get to this particular semantic distinction. But anyway, I would add further that as the person who writes this phases, the supreme difficulty in Marx's theory of value is precisely how, which is what I've been talking about in my sort of parenthetical remarks, is how to conceptualize abstract labor as a relational substance, which could be an oxymoron, in fact, which is to say how to not conceptualize value is merely relational, but as self-consistent across its manifold determinations, albeit dynamically, rather than conservatively slow. So what we see here is we've added additional nature to what seems to be more static to it. You've added something more dynamic to the analysis. Now, back to the text. This something is what Marx sought to uncover, and to do so without any of the arbitrary stipulations about market movements. That Say's law, where you have some correspondence between these things, among these things, made by political economists before him. This gets back to some comments made by Freeman. Now, to conclude part one, what has been argued is that Marx understood the relationship between price and value not as that between real and ideal magnitudes of capital. That seems relatively obvious, but there have been misunderstandings. So, in a manner analogous to the classical political economists before him, i.e., market prices versus natural prices, rather, he argued that prices are composed of values, even if it is at the same time through price that value receives its necessary form of expression. This one sentence has all this stuff, it's a pretty important issue. Further, the discrepancy between magnitudes of price, that is exchange ratios, and magnitudes of value, socially necessary labor time, is a result of the fact that the production of value is decoupled from and moves independent to its realization in the market. Now, I think the second half here is more important to think about. Things are getting, quote unquote, realized. So, you have some sort of sense of the actual that goes on here, as opposed to, kind of the front end, the kind of heuristic that you're sort of dealing with. So anyway, the mystery left to unravel is, in turn, not only how it is that value comes to be produced by labor and realized by capital, but also how the substance of value comes to regulate through its discrepancy with the form of price, its own production and realization. So, what we're seeing is an interesting codependency, as it were, or interdependent relation uh, between price and value in that particular sense, uh, as sort of conceived within the context of capital. As will be demonstrated in part two, unraveling this mystery has relevance not only for understanding the transfer of value between industries, i.e., of varying organic compositions of capital. Remember that the OCC in that particular context, but also within industries, that is, between industries, within industries, firm level, etc. And in particular, in my case, the oil sector. So he spent a lot of time in this part one trying to explain all this stuff. And, we'll get to part two. But I think this describes the problem. And as you can tell from, my sort of fiddling around with this, that you need to sort of consider certain other elements when you're even talking about the problem, realizing that every time you talk about these, that there's a constellation of discourse that involved each kind of assertion, there's a context for talking about these things. They are not as simple as we think, uh, price and value, etc. So that's the first part of this, and we'll talk more about the other matters. There are other matters on the same page, but that's enough for now. And I would assert to you that we probably need to talk about other things as well. Um, so we will, of course, get there either on Wednesday or in further discussions. And you'll note that I've included other elements here, Anwar Sheikh, among other things, that represent some of these issues, as you can sort of see in the references that are done in a very nice little piece. I mean, I think that this does describe the generalized problem with a little bit of tweaking. I think we have to sort of, maybe I'll, put something together to do that. But anyway, so that's part of the problem, and we'll look at that either on Wednesday or in subsequent weeks.